Hey folks, well today I want to talk about software development life cycles. Essentially the idea is for any complex project, right, if we've got a team of people to coordinate, we've got a long-term project, it's fairly complex, it really helps if we have some organized plan, some process that we're going to follow from the start to make sure everybody knows what we're doing and when, who's responsible for what. And there are a handful of common models that we want to look at, common processes that are pretty well accepted norms for the industry. So that's where we're going to go today. Let's see. Whenever you hear me talk about SDLCs, that's essentially what I'm referring to, a software development lifecycle. So there is no one tried and true right model. Every model has its own advantages and disadvantages. Which one you choose is going to depend on the strengths and the weaknesses of your team, of your client, the nature of the project itself, how complex it is, how long term it is, what the priorities for it are. So there are all sorts of different factors that are going to come into play. Again, we're going to look at three basic models. There are dozens and dozens of different models that you'll find people talking about. Most of them are either refinements or hybrids of one of the three that we're going to talk about today. So we'll start off with the simplest one, the waterfall model. Actually, no. Let me back up. There is one simpler model that I won't talk about much. It's essentially the idea of having no process at all, where we'll just kind of wing it. Old school, this is often referred to as the sort of Indiana Jones school of project management, where you decide, I'm just going to wing it, and if something goes wrong, then I'll do something heroic to save the day. But, again, that's not usually terribly practical, and that kind of a model is the cause of a lot of the huge software failures that you can find throughout the history of the industry. So, we're going to start off with the waterfall model and see where we get to. So the name for this model comes from the idea that we're going to have a series of distinct phases that we go through, and for each phase we'll complete it, go forward to the next one, and never go back. So you can kind of picture things as flowing from one phase to the next, and it's all downhill. You never go back to a phase you've been at before. Now, there are lots of different ways on, or lots of different ideas on what the right decomposition is, what the right set of phases are, and what the right order for these things are, and which activities belong in which specific phase. So I'm going to pick a fairly middle of the road breakdown, and again, you'll see a lot of variations on this. So pretty typical phases run something like this. We'll have a requirements phase where we figure out what it is we want to create, a planning phase where we figure out exactly what sequence of steps we're going to go through and who's going to be doing what at what time, an analysis and design phase where we figure out the structure of our solution, the structure of the system that we're going to design, come up with ideas on things like classes and modules and which components are going to be done where, and break it up. Think about what our division is going to look like in terms of maybe we're creating a web server with a bunch of mirrors and a database server with a bunch of mirrors, and we're going to think of this sort of architecture that we're going to use. So you're thinking at the design level. We're not worried about the actual code yet. We're just figuring out what all the different pieces are going to be and how they'll fit together. Then we'll have the implementation phase where we actually build it and test it and debug it. Then the deployment phase, where we actually roll it out and put it into operation so people start using it. And then the maintenance phase from there on out for the rest of the project's life, where we just keep fixing it and tweaking it and adding to the product as needed. So again, that's a pretty common breakdown of phases. So again, the idea for the requirements phase is that we want to figure out what people want, what they need, and what they're willing to pay for. We figure out the timeline, right? We're going to talk to the client, so let's think of that as whoever's paying for it. the end users, right? The people who are actually going to be using it. And it's not necessarily the same thing, right? We might have some sort of management at an organization paying for something and then somebody else using it. We also want to think of the other people that are impacted by whatever the product happens to be. And so to figure out what this is, you often wind up doing a lot of work and a lot of investigation. You know, you think about it, if you decide that you're going to develop a brand new product, you might be doing a lot of focus groups and a lot of experimentation and a lot of prototyping to try and figure out what it is people want. Or if a company hires you to develop a system for them, then you're going to go through this fairly extensive process of figuring out what it is they need. Right? They often have kind of general, vague ideas of what it is they need, or they think they need, or they want, or they think they want. But you're typically going to have to go through, you know, interview the people that are involved, maybe do surveys, research, discussion, focus groups again, talking to clients, users, whoever is affected, and try and figure out what they actually need, and try and document it all in a way that everybody can agree on, which is often a fun and exciting process in itself. Right? So by the end of this, we want to have figured out exactly what people want, exactly what they need, what does this product need to be in the end, and come up with some set of documentation that says, here, this is what we want. If you achieve this, we'll be happy. So from there, we might want to move on and decide, okay, now how are we going to get from knowing what it is they want to actually having it out and running? So we need to figure out what kind of a timeline we're looking at for the rest of the process, what kind of budgets we're looking at, what kind of staff do we need, what kind of resources do the staff need, what tasks, again, need to be carried out in which order, which things depend on which other things. And this is going to include all sorts of things, right? From developing content for whatever the project happens to be, right? So you might have all sorts of audio and visual content and all sorts of textual content and the code and whatnot that goes along with it and the data that needs to be in place to use it, and then all sorts of supporting infrastructure as well. So you're looking at budgeting and timelines, figuring out how you're going to keep track of whether you are actually on time and on budget, and how you're going to handle things if something goes off the rails a little bit. So again, a planning phase to figure out what you're going to be doing when, what you need and when you need it. Then, as I mentioned, the analysis and design phase, where we try and figure out a structure for our solution. Right? We've got the requirements to tell us what the clients actually want and need. We need to figure out how to build it. So again, you might have lots of different parts to this, and networking components and database components and AI components and graphics and sound and da-da-da-da-da-da, all sorts of things that can be very complex, and that we're going to have different people involved in each different portion of it, and we have to keep them all coordinated. We have to keep the solutions coordinated so that everybody can go off and work on their piece and know that when they come back with it, it's all going to fit together and work well. So we have to have some plan for how we're going to decompose this problem into manageable units, right? And then we can design the individual units to solve the problem and fit together in the end. So once we've got our design, we can go off and carry out the implementation, right? Go off and actually turn this in, develop all the supporting resources and develop all the code, test it, debug it, make sure it's all working, put the pieces together, test them, debug them, make sure they're all working. And in the end, in theory, we should have something that actually meets the requirements we came up with back in the beginning. Now, once we've actually got it, then we have to get it into a state where people can use it. So either this is, rolling it out and making it available for people to install, or if it's something particularly complex, we might be setting up all sorts of different servers and cloud support and installing software and operating systems and tools and client-side stuff and server-side stuff and configuring it and doing all the data entry and data conversion and whatnot. So there might be a huge amount involved in actually getting some complex product up and running for the client and the users. So again, this might be a fairly involved stage And we might go through and carry out, design a number of programs or scripts to help automate different steps in this, in which case we're going to be testing those as well to make sure that they actually work before we try using them for real. Right? So there's all sorts of things that might be involved in this deployment stage. And then, hopefully, once it's out there and running and working more or less as we think it should, we begin the maintenance phase, where we actually, the users and the clients are going to be working with the product for whatever its lifespan might be, whether that's months or years. But over the course of time, people are going to find defects most likely that we need to fix. People are going to come up with ideas, ways they want it changed to improve it, to make it better fit what they need. Their own needs are going to change, and it's going to need to be revised to address that. And then the environment that the product works in is going to change. You've got, always use the tax example. If you've got a piece of tax software, the tax rules change every year, so your software needs to be modified somewhat every year. So again, there's all sorts of things that are involved in the long-term maintenance of the product. And eventually, you're going to reach the end of the life cycle of this, and they're going to come up with something else that they want instead. But this maintenance phase is going to be one that's probably the bulk of the time of the lifespan of the project. Hopefully, at least. So again, this model is a nice and straightforward one. We have this sequence of really clear steps. We're going to go through them in order, and each step we're going to look at it, we're going to do it right, and then we're going to move on to the next one. And the notion is that we get each phase perfect as we go through, right? We get the requirements down exactly correctly, and then we move on to the next phase. Or we get the implementation phase down perfectly, and then we move on to the next phase. So this notion that we're never going to go back to an earlier phase keeps the management of this simple in theory and the planning simple in theory, but it's not very practical. If you've got a complex product, it's pretty rare that you're going to get your requirements exactly right the first time through. Usually, you're going to get somewhere later in the project and then realize, oh, we forgot to consider this. Or, oh, wait a minute, in one place in this giant requirements document, it says we need to do this, but in another place in this giant document, it says we need to do something else. Which one's correct? And so there's often this situation where you need to go back and revise your requirements later. And if you revise your requirements, then obviously you need to revise your design and your implementation and everything else. So it's a really nice, simple model, but it's not terribly realistic. In most projects, we wind up sort of going back and redoing things at different points in the project. So where this might work is if you've got relatively small projects that are pretty low risk. If you've got a good team that's done lots of work with similar products in the past, then there might be a pretty good chance that you can get things awful close to right the first time through. So in a situation like that, then you might decide, you know what, we can take a kind of waterfall approach. We're pretty confident that we can get this right as we go along. And if there are little things that we need to clean up, we're pretty confident that we're going to be able to do that without kind of really setting us back in the overall process. So there are situations where the waterfall model is usable, but you do have to be careful before you choose this as your model. So there's a first basic idea. What we'll do next is go on and look at a couple of other models that try and address this notion that we're going to have to go back and revise things sometime later. And how can we address that? How can we build that into our model? So we'll get there next time.